There is a fountain within a kingdom, ever flowing down to satisfy our hearts. It is the stillness beneath the chaos, and the current carries us into his arms. Our taste of heaven has just begun. Great is this peace, with greater still to come. There is a promise, born of the Spirit, holds a power all the earth could not contain. His mighty presence, alive within us, calls us out into the world to walk in faith. Our taste of heaven has just begun. Great is this hope, with greater still to come. Praise the Lord, oh my soul, for the peace we have yet to know. Praise the Lord, oh my soul, for the hope we have yet to know. There is a king who left a kingdom, sent to die and rise again, our lives to save. And there'll come a day when our eyes behold him, and we will gaze upon the fullness of his grace. Our taste of heaven has just begun. Great is this love, with greater still to come. Great is this love, with greater still to come. Great is this love, with greater still to come. Well, hello, friends. Welcome to Lunchbreak Live, your 15 minutes of hope in the middle of the day on Mondays and Fridays. And today it's Friday. Congratulations, you have made it to Friday. And I am so excited to celebrate Friday with you, to celebrate lots of things with you, including, if you've been under a rock and haven't heard, I just released my very first solo authored book called Singing in the Dark, Finding Hope in the Songs of Scripture. If you haven't gotten yours yet, there is a link in the little description of this broadcast that can tell you how to get that. But in celebration of that, I wanted to introduce you to a fabulous friend of mine, someone who has become a friend over the past few years. We're going to have to figure out when that started. But a friend who also helped me very much in editing the book, but who is also a fabulous writer, not just an editor, but also a fabulous writer in her own right. I'm excited for you guys to meet her and get all of your writing questions ready, because she will have great answers. So hi, Rachel Lulich. Welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming. Thanks for hanging out. So I was trying to think, the first time we met, it was because you booked me for a concert out in Portland.
Yes.
And what year was that?
I think that was 2015.
2015. Okay, that sounds about right to me. And I remember during that time reading a blog that you wrote about promoting a concert. And of course, I didn't know that you were a writer and that was really your thing, not concert promoting. But you wrote, did you write like 2 or 3 blogs about the process of
promoting? Yeah, I think I did a couple blogs about putting together the concert, and then you graciously let me interview you for my blog, and I had like 3 posts on that and a post about how to do an interview, because that was new to me as well.
Man, I love it. Well, I love how you chronicled so beautifully all of those journeys. And I was like, wow, this girl is just a brilliant writer. And so after that concert, and after I continued to read some of your writing, I don't even know how we got to this, but I was trying to do more blogging, which is always
Mhm.
hard for me as a songwriter. It's just not the first type of writing that comes naturally to me. And so I asked you if you would help me edit some blogs. And
Yep.
yes, and then the rest is history. And now I ask you to help me edit everything in the whole world. So thank you. Thank you for your editing magic. So I would love it if you would just tell our friends a little bit about you, because you have an uber fascinating story, journey, life. And I would love for folks to just know a little bit about you.
Sure. So, yeah, I've done some interesting things. I am from the Pacific Northwest, and grew up in mostly in Oregon, but also a little bit in Washington State,
Mhm.
and uh, did all the normal stuff until my senior year of high school. I went and was an exchange student in Germany,
So fun.
which was cool,
Yeah.
and I still consider Germany my second home.
So
And then I went to college, went to a year of grad school for a film production program that I ended up deciding was not the career path for me. And then I went and taught English in China for a year because what else does one do when one doesn't know what the next step is?
I love
And
it.
then, yeah. And when I came back from China, I joined the Air Force and I did that for 6 years.
Because what
Yep,
else does one do when one comes back from China but join the
that's
Air
right.
Force?
That's absolutely right.
My
Well,
goodness.
military service is something that had interested me for years, and I kind of finally decided, I if I wait too many more years, I'll be too old to join, and then I'll never know if I won't have the chance to do it. So I did
Yeah.
that. Glad I did.
Yes, that's
Uh,
so cool.
yeah, and while I was in, I got to go to Jordan for a month because I was an Arabic linguist, so I got to go on an immersion program for a month there. And I deployed to Afghanistan at one point where they don't speak Arabic, but I was doing a
Yes.
different job there. And then, yeah, got out and moved back to Oregon to get a master's in book publishing and started my editing business.
Yes.
And then shortly thereafter, moved out to Indiana, and I've been editing and writing more or less since then. But I did spend last year part of last year until the pandemic, teaching English in Slovakia.
Very, very cool. Yes, and she has the pictures to prove it, so you guys can
Yes.
follow her on Facebook and see those. So what got you interested in editing and writing? Where does an interest like that come from?
Yeah, great question. So, my interest in writing dates back to when I was very young. I was maybe 7 or 8 years old. My mom was writing a mystery, and she
Oh,
used to read it aloud to me and my brothers, and I just thought that was the coolest thing. So once I started reading more on my own and like reading Nancy Drew mysteries and stuff, I tried writing mysteries, which I learned I cannot do to save my life. Um, Mysteries are just not my genre, unfortunately. I love to read them. And yeah, so I think just I've always had a huge imagination. I love, making up characters and stories in my head. So it's kind of a natural progression to start writing them down.
wow.
Editing, I think, comes more from my love of reading,
Mhm.
which again, I've loved since third grade.
Yeah.
I know
Wow.
specifically since third grade because I was a very slow reader until third grade. I just took off
Oh,
thanks to my
interesting.
mom and a
Yeah,
teacher.
that is
And reading comprehension has always been one of my best skills, and so I'm a developmental editor, which is all the big picture stuff. And don't
yes.
ask me about grammar advice because I only know like half of that.
But you do it well, and yes, you are wonderful at development editing. And so tell me, I mean, is it sort of this is probably an obvious question, but can you describe the difference in, you know, what parts of the brain you use to think about editing versus writing? I mean, how does your
Oh,
mind kind of change when you're writing, when you're creating something on your own versus when you're editing someone else's?
that's a great question because they are two very different skills, and
Sure.
not all writers can edit, and vice versa. Um, I think so. When I'm editing, I definitely very much approach the project as a reader, and I just am thinking in a very I guess, organized fashion, if that makes sense. So I have to hold a lot of information in my head as I'm reading because, I have to be able to tell in chapter 10 if you've repeated something you already wrote in chapter 1, type of idea. So it's very much like sort of like a puzzle type game where you've got a lot of moving pieces, a lot of things to keep track of. And so I'm always very hyper focused when I'm editing, which is probably why it's so tiring.
Yes.
But yeah, it's just a very different perspective on the work. You're looking at it half from a reader's perspective, but a very critical reader's perspective. And knowing kind of what works and what doesn't. And a publishing house editor, even better, they're also a genre expert, which I'm not necessarily, depending on the project that I'm editing. Whereas writing, I find much more difficult because you have to make it up all by yourself. Editing, you're just picking on somebody else's work and helping them make it better. Yes. But writing, you've got to lay that foundation and lay that groundwork. And so for me, I have to spend a lot of time thinking about what I'm going to be writing. I often will talk through ideas with I have 2 older brothers, and one of them lives locally, and he's a scientist, and so he's really good at asking the right questions. So I like to talk through my ideas with him because I'll be like, I'm kind of thinking this, and he'll ask, well, what does that lead to in the book? And that'll get me thinking ahead, get me thinking ahead with plot and character development, which is great. And the actual writing, I'm mostly just sort of hearing it in my own head. It's more like picturing how it would be in a movie. Like I'm picturing the characters and thinking about, everything from how their voices sound and the expressions on their face, which I'm sure I make unconsciously while I'm writing. And the getting from point A to point B as well.
Gotcha. That's very cool. Well, I want to ask you some questions about writing, but before I do that, and you guys, if you want to write or like writing or have questions about how writing happens or how editing happens, please share your questions with us. We would love to know those. But before we talk about those, we'll give people a few minutes to maybe come up with some questions. Yeah. I would love to hear about two pieces of writing that you have released in the last year, I believe. Is it right? Or is it year and a half now?
Year and a half.
Year and a half. Okay. One of them, you're talking about your brother being a scientist. So one of them is sort of related. It's science fiction, and it's quite a read. I think I read it in 24 hours, called Random Walk. So do you want to tell folks a little bit about Random Walk?
Yeah. So Random Walk is a science fiction novel, and it's the first in a trilogy. And it's a near future space adventure about 3 astronauts who get stranded outside of our solar system when their experimental engine malfunctions. But they're not supposed to be outside our solar system. It's very near future. There's no faster than light technology. They don't have a hyperdrive or a Stargate or warp speed. So they at first don't even know what happens. So it's all about them trying to figure out what's going on. How do they survive in this new piece of part of space with no communications from ground control, which is a big deal because spaceflight is controlled from the ground. And with no faster than light communications either, they're on their own. So they've got to survive. And as the series continues, it's going to be a trilogy. They'll have to try to figure out, can we get home? Again, there's no faster than light technology, and the engine malfunction is not, quite controllable. So it's really kind of a teamwork, survival, problem solving scenario where everybody's trying to figure things out and come up with creative solutions. And meanwhile, there's danger because they're in space. And if everything isn't just right in space, you will die. So there's a lot of, urgent moments as well.
Yes, it is quite good. I highly recommend. We have a link in the notes to Rachel's website, so you guys go check that out. It's very, very excellent, very good read. I am so impressed with her science fiction abilities. I could never write anything such as this. But also on the other end of the spectrum, we have a play that you wrote, which is equally as wonderful, just a totally different idea. And the play is set in World War II. Do you want to tell us a little bit about just a little of the story behind that?
Yeah, so it's called The Confessing Church because that was the name of a church movement in 1930s, 1940s Germany. And the play is set in 1930s Germany at sort of the outset of all of this. And it follows a young woman named Anya who's trying to figure out how she should respond to this, rising tide of Nazi sentiment, and not only in her country but in the church. So there were two main church movements at the time. There was the German Christian faith movement, which was pro-Nazi, and there was the Confessing Church, which was various degrees of anti-Nazi. So you might recognize names like Bonhoeffer, for example, was a confessing church guy. Yeah. And in the play, it's a very close look. I wanted it to be about sort of ordinary people who are caught up in this extraordinary historical moment, because that's what everybody caught up in an extraordinary historical moment really is. And it's easy to lose sight of that. So Anya's friends and family are split between the German Christian faith movement and the Confessing Church. And so she's trying to figure out what to do. And really it comes down to, she has to really ask herself, what does she actually believe? And if she really believes that, how does that compel her to act or not act, as the case may be? So even though this is set in a very specific time period, it's a time period we know a lot about, but it's not an issue, I guess, that we know very much about, that most people know very much about. And it's because of those thematic elements, those things that Anya has to ask herself. It's pretty relevant for anyone in any time period, really, including us today.
Absolutely. Yes.
But I did a lot of historical research for that.
Oh, yes. Yes, it is very well researched. And I remember reading it and thinking, wow, this is very applicable for where we are now. So, well, you guys, I'm sure you've heard enough to have your interest peaked. So definitely find Random Walk and The Confessing Church and read them ASAP. You will not be disappointed by those. So last but not least, before we answer a few writing questions, I would love to hear maybe a most fun part or a most challenging part or both of editing Singing in the Dark. Now, we started this process, like I remember kind of roughing out the ideas, and you said 2017 was when, it was a long time ago. It's like a whole lot's happened since then. We've had pandemics and all kinds of other stuff. So yes, and it's been quite a journey. So you guys know, Rachel has been so great at, when I'm sort of wrestling with a part of a chapter, I email her and she actually responds and I say, does this make any sense? So that definitely makes her above and beyond most editors, in that she will respond to my many unending questions. So that probably was the challenge of editing SID. But anyway, I don't know. Any thoughts on that process, or anything that anyone would find interesting or fun to know about that process?
Yeah, I'll give you a most challenging and a most fun.
Okay.
I'll start with most challenging. You were not the challenging part.
Well, you
Trust
were kind.
Me. No. You're very easy to work with and better writer than you realize. But for me, as an editor, the most challenging part was probably the fact that I had never edited something like this project before. I'm mostly a fiction editor, and although I have edited 3 nonfiction projects, I'd only done one of them before we started digging into your book, and it was very different. It was strictly a memoir. And it was already complete, which is usually where I come into the editing process.
Right.
I'm not usually involved more from the ground up, as it were, editing chapters as you write them. That's not normally what I'm doing. So that was probably the most challenging part, just figuring out how to approach it, how to navigate that, and how to give good advice when, this is so far outside my normal genre. And then the most fun part, I mean, I'll say two fun parts. One was because I was involved from early days, it took us a lot of back and forth to sort of figure out how to format, how to approach
Yes.
the chapters, right?
Right.
But once we had that down, once we had like the introduction in chapters 1 and 2 in the bank,
Yes.
uh, everything after that was so much quicker and easier because you were like, all right, I got this. And you'd send me a draft and I'm like, oh, there's very little for me to do now all of a sudden. So that was fun to see you just kind of go whoop, and, sort of take off with it. And then also the book itself. I almost never read a book that I have edited once it has been published because I've already read it. I know where it was. I know where it's gone.
Yes,
And
you do.
yeah, sometimes multiple times. And I have other things I have to be doing. Um, but with your book, I've already read it in its final form and will again because the content is so good. And because of that invitation you have at the end of each chapter to write a response and memorize some scripture, I definitely want to do that. But I have not yet taken the time to do that. So I want to go back and read like just one chapter and take some time to think about it rather than reading through it as I have done.
Well, that is very cool. That is very gracious of you to be willing to read back through it. And yes, what Rachel says is true. I actually am one of those writers who loves being edited. I appreciate all feedback. Well, not all feedback in the world, but certainly I appreciated Rachel's feedback, and then my editors over at David C. Cook, I so appreciated their feedback as well. And so Rachel was wonderfully gracious about, even before I ever turned the book in, she and I had been through some of those chapters multiple times, and I would like I said earlier, I would send it to her and say, hey, does this make any sense? Hey, what do you think about if I change this? And she never once said, don't ask me any more questions. So she has a high tolerance for questions, and for that I am very, very grateful. So all right, so as we close, I'm going to ask a few of my favorite writing questions, and then we'll see if anyone else, Pepper will Pepper, our fabulous producer, will come and tell us if we have any more questions. But so one of my favorite questions to ask folks is, what are some of your favorite writing habits or practices?
Yeah. So I already mentioned talking through ideas with someone, and in this case, mostly my brother Stephen. And then I have two, I guess, unusual practices where I really go against the grain of what most writers do. One of them is people like to set word count goals for themselves, like, oh, I'm going to write X number of words every day. I find I just don't do well when I do that.
Mm-hmm.
So I set chapter goals. So
Oh.
I say, oh, I want to write, one chapter over the next 2 days, so half a chapter a day, or I want to write 4 chapters today, depending on the project and how much time I have for writing. And that I find works way better for me. Even though I know roughly what the word count of the chapter is going to be, there's a little bit of leeway word count wise, and it helps me think in terms of, chunks of story rather than chunks of words, if that makes sense. And
Yes.
then the other thing I do is I I break the primary number one rule that writers are told, which is do not edit as you go. Take off your editing hat and
Mm-hmm.
just write. And I break that rule for two reasons. Number one, I think I am an editor, so I think I can't totally shut that off. But also when I do and I just write and I just, put words on a page and don't worry about it,
Mm-hmm.
I always end up with something that I am deeply dissatisfied with, and that is going to require so much of a change. Basically, I just have to rewrite the entire thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of demoralizing, and then I just never do it.
Right.
Whereas if I edit as I go, if I really take my time writing in order to do that, I feel a lot better about the work as I'm writing.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes the first round editing process really easy as well. I'll get to the end of the project and I'll be happy with it. And I'll kind of already know in my head the main things that I need to change and how I want to change them. So some stuff I can leave for later, absolutely. But if I finish a chapter and I'm not happy with the chapter and I just move on to the next chapter is not going to be good either. And I'm going to end up throwing them both out and redoing them anyway. So I might as well stop, make that chapter that I just wrote satisfactory before moving on.
Yes. That sounds like a good plan. Yeah, I get that. I have started, as I've now been learning more about writing, I've started to do probably more of that too. Do more editing, because then it aligns my thoughts as I keep going. So how do you write when you don't feel motivated? Or do you write when you don't feel motivated?
Well, I think a lot of the time when I don't feel motivated is because I have needed to stop because I'm not satisfied with what I've written and sort of lost my place in the project, don't know what to do next. So if that's the reason I'm not feeling motivated, what I need to do is not write and just stop and sort of shift gears back into that pre-writing planning stage and sort of review the chapters I've already written, maybe edit them a little bit, and just review in my mind what the story's about, where I'm at in the storytelling, and where I need to get to from there, and what do I actually need to have in the next chapter in order to further that, push that train a little farther down the track. So sometimes it's just that. It's just pausing and shifting gears a little bit. So you're still, quote unquote, writing. You're just not necessarily putting words on the proverbial page. Or if I'm not feeling motivated just because I'm being lazy, deadlines are very, very helpful.
Yes.
So I can make a deadline for myself and
Yes.
tell other people about the deadline. So it's not just you.
Yes.
But if I'm actually a little like burned out maybe from working on a project, then, take a couple days off and just read or whatever, or write something short that's just for fun. I mean, a couple of times I've sent you little motivational rewritten song lyrics.
Yes, which are quite good.
Yeah, that's not part of my normal editing service, but there's been one or two times where I did that because I knew you were on a deadline and would enjoy it, but also I was stuck in what I was working on, and I thought, well, I'm just gonna write something playful and fun then that's short. It'll take an hour and, be done with it just to refresh the mind.
Yeah, I do think refreshing sometimes comes from purposely distracting yourself with something else, just almost stepping away. Like I've heard people say before, sometimes your best ideas come in the shower, and it's probably because you're not expecting them. You actually think you're doing something completely different, and that's when your brain has time to, sort of produce those ideas while you're not looking, while you're not thinking about it. So, Pepper, do we have any questions that we need to answer before we say adios? Hello.
People have been so gracious and fabulous, and there's so much love for both of you and for your projects, and everybody's loving what you have. People have been a little shy about commenting and questioning. There was a question from Samuel about writer's block and whether you experience it, and I think you kind of talked about that a little bit with the motivation just now. So maybe you want to expand on that a little. But there is a specific question from Jeanette about she loved your play. She said, how did you know where to begin your research for your play? I was unaware of just how significantly the church was impacted. So if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I typically start my research on the internet just because if I don't know very much about a subject, that's a good place to go to get a lot of broad information and ideas of where to go next. So I just Googled the Confessing Church and read the Wikipedia article on it. That was my starting point. And then from there, I went to more specialized websites that are a little bit more research worthy, if you will, and just looked up and got more information. I think there was a site with a timeline of World War II from a church history perspective. And then I checked to see what was in the library that I could get. And just anything on the topic. And I ended up relying quite heavily on just a couple of books. There was one about the church struggle, and it was all primary source documents translated into English, excerpts from those documents. And I later actually was able to get the book that they were drawn from at a used bookstore. But that was really helpful because it gave me a really good overview of the timeline because it was all presented chronologically. and the types of things that were being talked about by the people in that situation, and the types of documents they were putting out, the types of things they felt was important to address. And then there's an incredible book called Preaching in Hitler's Shadow, which is, there's a very, very long introduction, which will give you a ton of background, and there's a big section on the rhetoric being used at the time, which was very helpful to me writing a play, because plays are, like 95% dialogue. So I wanted to mimic some of that rhetoric. Some really interesting facts in there, that some of which were incorporated into the play, some of which didn't make it. And then each chapter starts with an introduction to a specific confessing church pastor, the history of their history, some of which ends during that time period because they were executed. And then a sermon that they actually preached, translated into English. And that was a phenomenal book. I highly recommend it. It's Preaching in Hitler's Shadow. It's very informative and really cool.
Oh man, once I'm done with seminary, I am reading that book. That sounds phenomenal. Wow. A very, very challenging to read, I'm sure, well, just heavy to read, but sounds really, really wonderful.
Oh, speaking of challenging to read, I also got on YouTube and looked up and found, much to my surprise, the entire Nazi propaganda film, The Triumph of the Will, in the original German, which I speak. So interestingly, there's not much speaking in it until like the last half hour. It is a long movie. Very interesting.
Wow.
And then, I didn't expect it to be so boring. And then I found the Nazi anti-Semitic propaganda film, which in English is called The Eternal Jew.
Oh, wow.
And that, I found an excerpt from that, I think, in English, and I found the entire video in German. And I watched, I think, about half hour of that, and I was like, that's enough of that. That was difficult to watch, but very, very informative. So I do not recommend it for casual viewing, but if you're doing research on anti-Semitism or Nazi Germany, it's an excellent resource if you can find it in English or if you speak German. It was really interesting. There's some very, Jenny, you'll remember this. There's some very, I've got some characters in my play who are Nazis, and they make some speeches, and some of the things they say are quite horrible. And it might interest you to know, Jenny, that I've actually watered down their language a little bit, because I felt it was the original, what people were actually saying would feel unrealistic to an audience.
Wow. Yes. Especially in today's time. Wow. That's incredible. That is
really interesting stuff.
Wow. On that note, my goodness. Wow. That is, thank you so much.
We should end with something lighter than that.
I know we should. I know. Well, here's one thing that we could end with. Samuel asked about what do you do to break writer's block? And I would say one of the things that I love to do is just to, it's kind of like, as we were talking about earlier, the idea of tricking your brain into not feeling the pressure. So for me, just getting up in the morning and spending some time writing, even if it's only 10 minutes, just writing down thoughts and feelings and ideas. And maybe at first that's just facts. And then as you continue to write, more things flow out of you. But I think even just that process of having either pen and paper or computer and your brain connecting in that way, it helps you to slowly unblock. One of my favorite books about that is The Artist Way by Julia Cameron. Kind of older book by now, but she talks about something she calls morning pages, which are just writing unedited in the morning, and not going back and even looking at what you've written. So I think you could do that as well, or you could just spend your whatever time you have, 5 or 10 minutes, just writing, just connecting with your thoughts and writing them down. I often have found that has helped me unblock in writing, even in songwriting. So what about you? Any writer's block tips?
Yeah, and I've done morning pages in the past as well at times. So that can be helpful, just to get the creative juices flowing, as it were. And Also, reading about craft can sometimes do that as well.
Oh,
If
yeah.
you might learn something new in something that you're reading or watching, I don't know, a YouTube video where somebody's talking about craft or whatever. If something new comes up, you might be like, "Ooh, I should try that," and kind of
Yes.
get you going. Writing prompts, if
Yeah.
you don't know what to do, look up a writing prompt and just write a story and don't care if it's any good or not, because you're not going to publish it just to get going. I think that's probably the type of thing I do most.
Wow, that's very excellent. Yes, writing prompts are quite good.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Ms. Rachel, for joining us today.
Thank you.
It's been so wonderful to hear about your books, your plays, your writing, your editing, your extreme patience, goodness, and kindness as an editor. You guys can find Rachel's stuff at her website, which is in the notes here. You can also find Singing in the Dark, my book, as well as if you are on any of the streaming sites, Apple, Spotify, etc., pre-save the companion piece to my book, which is called Sing Hope in the Darkness, and it comes out on Friday. So you can pre-save that now and hear a couple of the songs that are already out. So do that. So you got lots of reading and listening to music to do, friends. So I hope you will get after that this weekend and enjoy it. And Rachel, thank you very, very much for your time.
Thank you, Jenny. It was great.
All right. See you guys later. Have a super weekend.